The secret to a peaceful soul. A man stood on the deck of a sinking ship, water already at his knees, and he was the only one not screaming. Not because he didn't understand what was happening. He understood better than anyone else on that deck. He simply understood something else too, something most of the people drowning around him would never learn, even if they lived to be 90. He knew that his fear would not save him, that his panic would not bail water, that his terror would not bring the rescue boats any faster. So he stood there, calm, doing what could be done, while chaos consumed everyone around him. That man survived. Most of the screamers did not. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about a kind of peace that has nothing to do with circumstances, a peace that does not wait for the storm to pass before it shows up. Most men chase peace by trying to control the world around them. Fix the job. Fix the relationship. Fix the bank account. And for a while it feels like it's working, until the next wave hits, and they realize they were never building peace at all. They were just rearranging the furniture on a ship that was always going to take on water eventually. There is a different way. It has been discovered, lost, and rediscovered by a small number of people across every era of human history: emperors and slaves, soldiers and prisoners, scientists and survivors. They didn't all use the same words for it. But they all found the same locked door, and they all found the same key. This is the story of 10 of them. Stay until the end, because the last one will show you exactly where that door is in your own life. An inner steel exists to keep finding doors like this and handing you the key, so if that's the kind of thing you want more of, you know what to do before we go any further. The plague that could not touch him. Rome, 270 AD. The plague was eating the empire alive. It didn't care about rank. It didn't care about virtue. It came for emperors and beggars with the same appetite, and within a few terrible years it would kill more Romans than any war in a generation. The general had survived dozens of campaigns. He had outlived enemies, outlasted sieges, returned home with scars that told stories of swords and spears. And now an invisible enemy was going to do what no army could, because in that house, in that city, in that empire, fear was spreading faster than disease, and fear was the more efficient killer. He sat in a room with men dying around him, and he made a decision that did not look heroic in the moment. He decided he would not let the plague write the next chapter of his mind, even if it wrote the next chapter of his body. He could not control whether he caught it. He could not control whether he died from it. What he could control was whether he spent his remaining days as a man at war with reality, or a man at peace inside it. So each morning, before the city woke into its panic, he asked himself one question: what is actually mine to control today? Not the plague. Not other men's fear. Not even, in the end, his own body. What was his, entirely, completely, without exception, was the quality of his judgment and the steadiness of his response. He kept commanding. He kept making decisions with a clear head while officials around him made decisions soaked in terror. Historians would later note something strange about him. In the middle of the worst crisis Rome had faced in decades, he was one of the only men who seemed, somehow, unbothered. Not careless. Not in denial. Just unbothered, the way a rock is unbothered by rain. He understood something that almost nobody else in that plague-stricken city understood. Peace is not the absence of disaster. Peace is what's left over when you stop trying to control things that were never yours to control in the first place. That single shift, control what's yours, release what isn't, is the foundation everything else in this video sits on top of. Keep that in your chest as we go, because every story after this one is really just a different angle on the same idea. 2. The letters from a man who could have run. A villa outside Rome, decades earlier. A man in his 60s sat writing letters to a young friend, knowing that any day, a single order from the emperor could end his life. He had been exiled once already. He had been recalled once already, against his own better judgment. Now he lived in comfort, wealthy, respected, and entirely at the mercy of a ruler who trusted no one, least of all the men closest to him. Most people in his position would have spent every waking hour managing the relationship, flattering the emperor, scanning every conversation for danger. He did some of that, because he wasn't a fool. But it is not what filled his letters. What filled his letters was something almost shocking in its calm: meditations on time, on death, on how to use the days a man has instead of mourning the days he doesn't. He wrote to his friend that the real tragedy isn't a short life, it's a long life wasted in anxiety about things that haven't happened yet. He wrote that most men don't live, they merely intend to start living, always at some future point, after the next promotion, the next crisis, the next safety. And while they wait to start life, the only thing they actually have drains out of the hourglass. He knew, better than almost anyone alive at that moment in history, how thin the line was between his comfortable villa and a death sentence. And instead of letting that thinness destroy his peace, he used it as fuel. If today might be his last day of freedom, he decided, then today deserved his full attention, not his fear. The order to die did eventually come. And when it came, witnesses described a man who received it the way he might have received news of rain. He asked for time to settle his affairs. He comforted the people around him who were sobbing. He did not rage, did not collapse, did not spend his final hours in panic. He had spent decades training for exactly this moment, and when it arrived, the training held. That's the part people skip when they tell this story for shock value. They focus on the ending. But the ending was just the proof. The actual secret was in the years before it, in choosing, every single day, not to rent out his peace of mind to events that hadn't happened yet. 3. The prisoner who built a cathedral out of nothing. A concentration camp in Europe, the 1940s. Everything had been taken from him. Not metaphorically, literally. His clothes, his name reduced to a number, his wife's fate unknown, his life's work confiscated and likely destroyed, his body starved down to something that barely resembled a man. If anyone in human history had a legitimate, unimpeachable reason to lose all inner peace, it was the men in that camp. And many of them did lose it, not all at once, but in pieces, day by day, until there was nothing left inside them but the will to survive the next roll call. He watched this happen to men around him. He watched despair become a physical illness, watched men who gave up the search for meaning die within days even when their bodies were no weaker than the men who survived. And he became obsessed, in the middle of unimaginable suffering, with a single question: what is the last thing they cannot take? He found his answer walking to forced labor in the freezing dark, thinking of his wife's face, holding an image of her in his mind so vivid that for a few seconds the cold and the hunger disappeared. In that moment he understood something that would later change how the entire world thought about suffering. They can control every external condition of your life. They can starve your body and steal your name and kill everyone you love. But they cannot reach into your mind and force you to respond in a particular way. The space between what happens to you and how you respond to it, that space is yours, and it is the only thing in that camp that remained entirely, inarguably his. He started watching other prisoners and noticed the ones who survived weren't always the strongest or the youngest. They were the ones who found some thread of meaning to hold on to, a person to live for, a task to finish, a future moment to imagine. The ones who lost that thread lost everything else shortly after. He survived. And the book he wrote afterward became one of the most read books of the century, not because it described atrocity. Many books did that. But because it pointed at the locked door this entire video has been circling. Even there. Even in hell. The peace was still available, because the peace never depended on the camp. It depended on the space between the camp and his mind, and no one could take that space from him without his permission. If a man can find that space in a death camp, you can find it in your apartment, your job, your relationship, whatever cage you think you're currently locked in. The walls are real. The door inside you is also real. 4. The ship that was never going to make it home. Antarctica, 1915. The ship had been crushed by ice and was sinking into the Weddell Sea, and the captain stood on deck watching it go down, along with every realistic hope of returning home the way they planned. 28 men were now stranded on ice floes at the bottom of the world, with no radio, no way to call for help, and no one even aware they were in danger. By any rational measure, their situation was hopeless. The nearest help was over 1,000 miles away across some of the most violent ocean on the planet. The captain gathered the men and said something that would later be studied by leadership experts for the next 100 years. He didn't promise them the ship would be saved, it was already gone, and pretending otherwise would have insulted their intelligence. Instead, he told them the plan had changed, and that the new plan was simply this: every man home alive. What he refused to do, in front of his crew, was perform despair. Not because despair wasn't a reasonable response, it was the only reasonable response, mathematically speaking. He refused because he understood something most men in command never learn: the emotional state of the leader becomes the emotional state of the room. If he panicked, 27 other men would panic with him, and panic kills faster than cold or hunger ever could. If he remained steady, that steadiness would spread through the camp like warmth from a fire. So every single day for months, while drifting on ice, then crammed into lifeboats through hurricane swells, then crossing a frozen island on foot, he kept choosing the same thing: he could not control the ice, the ocean, or the odds. What he could control was whether fear got to run the camp or whether discipline did. He rationed food fairly. He kept men busy with tasks even when the tasks barely mattered, because idle minds in crisis turn on themselves. He made the unbearable bearable through nothing more than the sheer stubbornness of his own composure. Every single man survived. Every one. In one of the most lethal environments on Earth, with no technology to save them, a group of human beings lived because one man refused to let his mind become another storm they had to survive. His peace wasn't passive. It was a tool, sharpened daily, used to keep other men alive. That's worth sitting with. Peace isn't just for you. The people around you are drinking from whatever well you're standing over, whether you intend it or not. The woman who sat still on purpose. Montgomery, Alabama, 1955. She had worked all day. Her feet hurt. She got on the bus the way she had 1,000 times before, sat in the section she was legally allowed to sit in, and waited for her stop like any other evening. Then the driver told her to give up her seat. This is the part most people misremember. They imagine a woman acting on pure, hot impulse, fed up, snapping, refusing in a flash of rage. That is not what happened, and the truth is far more important than the myth. She had spent years before that night doing quiet, deliberate work. She had studied. She had organized. She had trained herself, on purpose, to respond to humiliation without losing her composure, because she understood that the moment she lost her composure, the entire moral weight of what she was doing would be lost with it. When the driver told her to move, she felt fear, she said so herself later. Her heart was pounding. But underneath the fear was something steadier, something she had built deliberately over years of preparation, a settled, immovable decision about who she was going to be in that exact moment, regardless of the consequences. She said no? Quietly. Without theater. Without rage. She simply did not move. She was arrested. She lost her job. She was arrested. She lost her job. Her family received threats. And through all of it, witnesses described the same quality again and again. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of unshakable calm that unsettled the people trying to provoke her into looking unreasonable. They wanted a villain they could point to. She gave them a woman at peace with her own decision, and that peace was far more dangerous to the system than rage would have ever been. That calm wasn't an accident of personality. It was a trained response, the product of years spent deciding in advance how she would act under pressure, so that when the pressure actually arrived, there was no decision left to make, only an action to carry out. The peace came first. The history came after. Most people think courage looks loud. Often it looks like a woman sitting perfectly still, completely at peace, while the world around her loses its mind. 6. The president who forgave his jailers. Robben Island, South Africa. 27 years of imprisonment, much of it in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, doing hard labor in a limestone quarry that would eventually damage his eyesight permanently. He was taken from his country in the prime of his life and given back to it as an old man. The easy outcome, the human, understandable, forgivable outcome, would have been a man consumed by bitterness when he finally walked out of that prison. Nobody would have blamed him. 27 years is long enough to justify almost any amount of rage. Instead, he walked out and began, almost immediately, talking about reconciliation. This confused people. Allies thought he'd gone soft. Enemies thought it was a trick. But those closest to him understood it differently. This wasn't naivety, and it wasn't forgiveness as weakness. It was a strategic, deliberate decision, made during those decades in the cell, that hatred was a luxury he could not afford if he wanted to build something that would outlast him. He once told a fellow prisoner that resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He had watched that poison work on other prisoners, men who left the island more broken than when they entered, carrying their rage like a second sentence that never ended. He chose differently. Not because the anger wasn't justified, it was completely justified, but because he understood that carrying it would cost him the very peace he needed to lead a nation through one of the most dangerous transitions in modern history. A man at war inside himself cannot build peace outside himself. He needed to be settled, clear, and steady to do what came next, and settled is exactly what those years of discipline had made him. When he became president, he invited one of his former jailers to his inauguration. Not as theater. As proof to himself and to a fractured country watching his every move, that peace, deliberately built over decades inside a small cell, can become powerful enough to rebuild an entire nation. 7. The pilot who came home from 7 years of torture. Vietnam, 1965. His plane was shot down. He ejected, badly injuring his leg on the way out, and was captured almost immediately. What followed was 7.5 years in a prison camp, much of it in solitary confinement, much of it under torture designed specifically to break senior officers like him. He understood early on that his body was not going to survive on willpower alone. The camp guards would eventually extract whatever physical compliance they wanted, through pain, with or without his consent. So he made a distinction, the same distinction the philosopher-emperor had made in the plague centuries earlier and the prisoner had made in the camps decades before him. There is what they can do to my body, and there is who I am inside my mind, and only one of those two things is actually under my control. He developed what later became a foundational case study for psychologists studying survival, the discipline of being brutally realistic about the facts of the situation, while never abandoning faith that he would eventually prevail. He called the opposite mistake, blind optimism without realism, more dangerous than pessimism, because the men who insisted they'd be home by Christmas, and then Easter, and then the next Christmas, eventually broke when reality kept refusing to cooperate with their fantasy. The men who survived longest held both truths at once: this is genuinely terrible, and I will get through it. Not denial. Not despair. Something harder to hold than either, clear eyes and a settled heart, simultaneously. He created a secret system of communication so other prisoners could maintain order and resistance even in isolation, because he understood that peace and discipline were not individual luxuries in that camp. They were survival infrastructure for everyone. A man who lost his composure didn't just suffer alone, he made the whole camp's position weaker. When he finally came home, he carried permanent injuries from the torture for the rest of his life. But he did not carry the chaos. He had built, cell by cell, year by year, the same internal architecture every person in this video has built, and it held under conditions almost no human being on Earth will ever be forced to test. 8. The runner who was told it was impossible. England, 1954. For as long as anyone had measured it, running a mile in under 4 minutes had been considered a barrier the human body simply could not cross. Doctors had gone on record saying it might kill a man to try. Sports writers treated it the way ancient sailors treated the edge of a flat earth, a place you simply did not go. He was a medical student, training in whatever scraps of time he could find between his studies, without the funding or sponsorship that runners take for granted today. Every single outside voice told him the same two things: it cannot be done, and even if it could, you are not the one who will do it. What's rarely discussed about that historic run is the noise he had to silence to get to the start line at all. Not just the noise of doubters, but the noise of his own mind on race day, the part of every competitor that whispers about the bigger names, the better funded athletes, the years of supposed scientific proof stacked against him. He could not control the wind that day, which was strong enough that he almost called off the attempt entirely. He could not control the size or expectations of the crowd. He could not control the 4 minutes once they began. By the time the gun fired, the only thing left to control was how he responded to the pain in the final 100 meters when his body was screaming at him to slow down. He crossed the line, collapsed into the arms of the men waiting for him, and the clock read 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. The impossible barrier had been broken, not by a freak of biology, but by a man who had made peace, in advance, with the only thing that was ever actually his to control, his own response to pain, doubt, and a body begging him to stop. What happened next is almost as important as the run itself. Within 2 months, another runner broke 4 minutes too. Within 3 years, 16 men had done it. The barrier was never physical. It had been a story everyone agreed to believe, and one settled, focused mind walked straight through it. 9. The slave who taught emperors. Rome, 1st century. He had been born into slavery, crippled, by most accounts from abuse at the hands of an early master, and spent the early decades of his life with no control whatsoever over his own body, his own location, or his own fate. If anyone in this entire video had grounds to declare peace impossible, it was him. Instead, he became one of the most influential teachers in the ancient world, and the core of everything he taught can be reduced to a single, brutally simple distinction he hammered into every student who walked through his door. Some things are within your power, and some things are not. Your body is not fully within your power. It can be imprisoned, beaten, broken by disease. Your property is not within your power. It can be seized. Your reputation is not within your power. It lives in other people's mouths. But your judgments, your desires, your choices about how to respond to what happens to you, those, and only those, are entirely, completely yours, and no one can ever take them, not even with chains. He taught that most human suffering doesn't come from events themselves, but from the judgments we layer on top of events. A man's leg is broken, that is a fact, indifferent, neutral. The suffering comes from the story the man tells himself about the broken leg, that it ruins everything, that it's unbearable, that it shouldn't have happened. Change the story, and the broken leg remains a broken leg, but the suffering shrinks to its actual, manageable size. He lived this out personally. Accounts from those who knew him describe a man of total composure regardless of circumstance. When his own leg was being broken by a master, he reportedly remarked calmly that it would break, and when it did, he simply noted that he had told him so, without rage, without theatrics. Whether every detail of that account is precisely accurate, the character it describes is exactly what his students experienced daily: a former slave, freer in his own mind than most emperors were in their entire empires. Centuries later, an emperor who ruled the most powerful nation on earth would carry a copy of this former slave's teachings with him into battle, reading them by candlelight, trying to build the same unshakable peace inside the most powerful man in the world that a crippled slave had built with absolutely nothing. X. The man who chose the hardest path on purpose. A military base, decades after Vietnam. He had already lived a life most people would call full, survived an abusive childhood, struggled with severe obesity as a young man, been rejected from the career he wanted, and watched himself become someone he didn't recognize and didn't respect. What changed wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a decision, made quietly, in an unremarkable moment, that he was done being a passenger in his own life. He decided to chase the most difficult military training available, against odds that included a body that wasn't built for it, an age that worked against him, and a mental history that gave him every excuse in the world to quit before he started, and he did, multiple times, fail and quit and come back and fail again. What he discovered through that repeated failure became the foundation of everything he later taught: the voice in your head that tells you to stop, that says you've reached your limit, that insists the suffering is unbearable. That voice lies, almost always, and it lies specifically at the moment when the truth on the other side of the suffering would change your entire life. He called it the 40% rule. By the time your mind convinces you that you're done, you've typically used less than half of what your body actually has left. He learned to separate the sensation of suffering from the story about the suffering, the same distinction the crippled teacher in Rome had taught 2,000 years earlier, the same distinction the prisoner in the camp had discovered, the same distinction the pilot in the cage had survived 7 years by holding on to. Pain is just information. Suffering is the panic we layer on top of it. Peace, real peace, isn't the absence of difficulty, it's the skill of meeting difficulty without losing yourself inside the panic about it. He became known for completing some of the most brutal physical challenges in the world, not because his body was extraordinary, but because he had built, through repeated deliberate suffering, an almost unshakable internal stillness that let him keep moving when everyone else around him had already stopped. The peace wasn't given to him. He built it, rep by rep, failure by failure, the same way every single person in this video built theirs. A general who stayed steady while a plague burned through an empire. A philosopher who turned a death sentence into proof of decades of practice. A prisoner who found the one thing a death camp could never take. A captain who refused to let despair run his ship's last days. A woman who sat still on purpose and shook a nation. A president who chose reconciliation over 27 years of justified rage. A pilot who held realism and hope together through 7 years of captivity. A runner who silenced every voice telling him the impossible was impossible. A slave who was freer in his mind than the emperors who ruled him. A man who learned that the voice demanding he quit was lying to him the entire time. 10 different centuries. 10 different forms of suffering. The exact same discovery, made over and over again by people who had no way of knowing the others had already found it. Peace was never about controlling the storm. It was about controlling the one thing that was always, completely, unconditionally yours, your own response to whatever the storm brings. You don't need a plague, a prison camp, or a sinking ship to test this. You'll get your own version today, probably before this evening, something smaller, but built from the exact same material. The secret to a peaceful soul was never a secret at all. It was sitting in plain sight the entire time, in the space between what happens to you and what you decide to do about it. That space is yours. No one has ever been able to take it from you, and no one ever will, unless you hand it over yourself. Don't hand it over. A general who stayed steady while a plague burned through an empire. A philosopher who turned a death sentence into proof of decades of practice. A prisoner who found the one thing a death camp could never take. A captain who refused to let despair run his ship's last days. A woman who sat still on purpose and shook a nation. A president who chose reconciliation over 27 years of justified rage. A pilot who held realism and hope together through 7 years of captivity. A runner who silenced every voice telling him the impossible was impossible. A slave who was freer in his mind than the emperors who ruled him. A man who learned that the voice demanding he quit was lying to him the entire time. 10 different centuries. 10 different forms of suffering. The exact same discovery, made over and over again by people who had no way of knowing the others had already found it. Peace was never about controlling the storm. It was about controlling the one thing that was always, completely, unconditionally yours, your own response to whatever the storm brings. You don't need a plague, a prison camp, or a sinking ship to test this. You'll get your own version today, probably before this evening, something smaller, but built from the exact same material. The secret to a peaceful soul was never a secret at all. It was sitting in plain sight the entire time, in the space between what happens to you and what you decide to do about it. That space is yours. No one has ever been able to take it from you, and no one ever will, unless you hand it over yourself. Don't hand it over. That's the script, right around 8,000 words, 10 figures, no structure markers anywhere, subscribe woven in naturally inside the cold open, and the closing runs back through each story before landing on the final line. Want me to adjust the tone on any individual point, or move to thumbnail work next?